Today I'm delighted to introduce the work of contemporary artist Annie Cattrell, one of the exhibitors in Waterland at the Fen Ditton Gallery near Cambridge until the 28th of November. Welcome, Annie. Annie studied at Glasgow School of Art and the Royal College of Art and currently lives and works in London. She has a multidisciplinary practice working in both 2 and 3 dimensions, often on site-specific public artworks, and has a particular interest in exploring the interface between visual thinking and scientific knowledge. She has collaborated with specialists in meteorology, engineering, history of science and neuroscience, and she is currently the lead artist, public artist at University College London's new neuroscience research facility.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's a great honour to be part of the Waterland show at Fen Ditton Gallery.
So we're delighted to include 2 of your drawings in Waterland, as your work feels particularly resonant in this context. As a show, Waterland is rich in works that give sensory form to the fluctuating rhythms and material qualities often found in fen landscapes. At heart are places we all know in constant flux, qualities that are often found in Cattrell's own work. As the critic Stephen Connor commented in a recent catalogue, the artist's work seemed to be drawn to the zone where the exact and the fragile converge. And this feels a very sort of strong theme for the wider show. One exhibited work shown here is Brink, which is from a series of paper cuts which evoke, through precise rendering of line and form, the energy of this flow and flux. Annie, shall we start by talking a little about the origins of this series of works and perhaps look at 1 or 2 of the wider series of paper cuts to which this one belongs?
Yes, it was interesting for me to, it was when I first moved to London about 25 years ago, and I didn't have a studio, and I have always felt the need to make work even when I haven't had a studio, and I had a living room, and I wanted to make things, but I wasn't sure if drawing was kind of enough. So I started to use a knife to cut into quite thick paper because it was sort of like a material, it became like a material for me. So if you look very closely at these works, they're really difficult to document, but that's why that image in my studio is taken from the side, because the lighting is kind of critical to make them visible. And what they are is a kind of thousands of vector shape cuts, which make a little kind of almost like an arrow, as it were. And I was looking at meteorological maps and also just generally maps, and thinking about that idea of travel and how water was, and all this work is kind of alluding to water, particularly the titles. I mean, some of the titles are things like, well, obviously this one's Brink, but one of them was Verge and Pour. And I didn't want them to be illustrations of that, but I wanted them to give the kind of sensibility of something that had a kind of gravitational pull, like the one on the left was Pour. And the other one on the right is actually part of the whole series of work I've done over the years, which I've called Currents 1, 2, and various kind of different ones, whether they're in ink or cut paper. The one on the right is actually really quite large. I think, as far as I recall, it's about 5 foot by 5 foot. And actually began to kind of almost resemble like looking down on an aerial photograph of land or wind or something elemental, or even some people felt it looked a bit like a pelt of an animal. And I quite liked that idea that you didn't really know what you were looking at, but in a way it alluded to kind of the sense of something being alive and in a constant state of flux, as Stephen Connor talks about. And they are fragile. I mean, they won't, if you don't touch them, they won't fall apart, but they are cut to the nth degree out of one piece of paper, all of this work. There's no pencil marks or anything like that. So they do kind of alter the structure of the 300-gram Bockingford acid-free paper, which I tend to use, and they kind of alter it and make it sag. And I like that from the perspective that it felt very sculptural and material.
I think they have this tremendous sort of energy. I mean, it is always difficult when you see something this resonant on a screen, because you're losing a sort of dimension, because you get this rather wonderful low relief. And as you say, when you get the side light, the way we've hung them at Fen Ditton, you get a kind of side light, not direct light. And, you know, at various moments in the day, you know, you feel there is movement in the actual piece. It's sort of fascinatingly strong.
Well, it's been a kind of another aspect of my work is thinking about that idea of frozen moments and being able to see things and observe things which are in a constant state of movement, and therefore understand them in a more full way. So it's almost like a resting time, as you might in a photograph. I mean, when I was at art school in Glasgow many years ago, I was taught by, amongst many people, Thomas Joshua Cooper, who's a photographer, very important. And I was very struck by his long exposures of water. And actually, fairly recently, about 5 years ago, met him again, and he was still talking about standing in the middle of, getting the right vantage point and standing in the middle of water in the freezing cold with a very long exposure in order to get the kind of movement which would allow then the case that he does, you know, he usually has something which is also very still adjacent to it, so that you kind of can make that strange comparison of a rock, say, and then the water moving. And so that influenced me. You know, it was one of the things that was in the back of my mind. And also, I suppose it's just the irreversible nature of cutting I like too. So the focus when I'm doing it, I'm very engaged, very sort of, I can't be thinking of anything else. And when I think, if you look at these, I don't necessarily, apart from maybe the top layer where I decide not to cut the top strip of the left-hand piece in pour, but that's all I do really. And I decide on where the vector lines are going. And the rest of it just comes through doing it. It sort of like actually sort of shows up my inaccuracies, in the sense that the movement veers to one side or the other side. And then once I begin to enjoy that and look at it and get up and stand far away, I perhaps begin to exaggerate it more. But the one on the right, that currents, that was me moving around the paper a lot.
Well, it has that, you know, people often talk in terms of the sort of dynamic effect of asymmetry, you know, and you know, what's interesting, as you say, when you're cutting into something, you're sort of creating a slightly different material, but there's also a real sense of, you know, that balance, which I feel comes up often looking at the things we're going to be looking at. You know, you are doing something which requires a lot of considered work within a structure, you might say a more scientific approach, and this kind of freedom and asymmetry. And the work captures, you know, an incredible, it is embodied sense of flow.
So that shows it from the side, and I think you can see the depth of field shows, you know, out of focus at the back. So yes, it does kind of, the way that the viewer looks at it kind of activates it, as it were.
That sort of moving around as you would a sculpture, and in a way, and in a way they sit in that sort of hinterland that, you know, between the drawings and the sculpture, or the 2 and 3 dimensions, which are part of your work. But that sense of, you know, flow in a different sense, because they require, I imagine anyway, a lot of concentration, is something about, you know, that flow state we often talk about. Does that link to some of the research you've done, or the interests you have in neuroscientific research, which is showing more and more about the physical quality of our thinking, I suppose?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of 1990, it was, when I still lived in Edinburgh, and I did a residency in the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, working with, working on my own work in relationship to working with long-term residents there. And in those days, there wasn't so much sort of obvious connection between things like brain scanning and identifying the behavior of the brain and so forth. It was happening, I know, but it wasn't commonplace to know about it. And then it did seem to me, when I was there and talked to all the residents, most of whom were long-term, where I particularly, the actual building I was situated on, Craig House, near Craiglockhart, which was the Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon place they went to, you know, to recover from the World War I. Yeah. But anyway, so there's a long history of it, of psychiatric help up there and so forth. But it seemed that there was a kind of, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation as an artist being there, that there was a lot of blanket descriptions of what was wrong with people. And I felt, and I think many people did, but it was just very difficult to know how to treat people with, say, for example, schizophrenia or bipolar disorders. But the drugs they were given in those days, which I think is changing all the time, especially where I'm working at the moment for the new research centre in London on neurodegenerative diseases. But the point I suppose I was aware of was just the idea that everybody was different, and yet they were getting similar treatment.
Yeah.
And it felt quite blanket. And I was just very fascinated with thinking much more about the kind of hinterland of the brain at that time. And I think, to be fair, in those days, I mean, that's a long time ago now, it was almost people, you know, the unknown was something, you know, the kind of way that the brain behaved and the kind of attitude that people had, where it was quite sort of nervous, I suppose, about how people behaved and how it manifests itself in their behavior, their mental health issues and so forth. So that was at the back of my mind. And then when I later on was in London, and then I got the opportunity to work with various neuroscientists, including Morten L. Kringelbach, who's well worth listening to. He's on YouTube and so forth. I was that was one of my first questions, was sort of like, was consciousness physical? Could you kind of pinpoint something in the brain? Which sounds deeply naive, I know, but I kind of thought, well, you know, they're mapping the brain. There's a huge, massive program, which is international, about mapping the brain and as a sort of atlas, as it were, like we map the world. Is it possible to kind of identify where consciousness is? And of course it isn't, but it's an amalgamation of different things at the very least. But it also felt kind of really interesting to think about where body and brain or mind, or whatever one calls it, connect. And I suppose I came away thinking that really, you know, the brain is physical as the body, as much as the heart is. It's just very, very complicated and complex, and maybe not as understood as perhaps the heart is, because it's so complex. And it's only taken these non-invasive things like MRI scans and CT scans, where you can scan a brain of somebody while they're still alive, rather than having to get all your evidence from, say, in the past, an autopsy or a research into kind of donated bodies and so forth. So there's that kind of very much living aspect of it, which really appeals to me and interests me a lot. I'm not an expert in neuroscience, but I'm completely fascinated by it. So I've made pieces of work, which some of them have ended up in exhibitions about the brain, including a piece that was in the Wellcome Trust called Sense, and which is actually going to another exhibition in Germany about the brain, opening in next January. So it feels really nice that the way that I've approached it alongside the neuroscientists has been sort of somehow recognized, not necessarily as scientifically important, but maybe scientifically kind of interesting.
I think you know, it's a very in some senses intangible area. I mean, that's you know, the word intangible often comes up whether we're talking about something being very material, very physical, because, you know, when you're inviting somebody to come and look at something, and obviously the looking and potentially, as you say, walk around it, spend some time with it, an image or, you know, an object in some shape or form, you know, what is happening is some kind of communication between the person viewing and the work, and behind that, the person who made the work. And so that has always seemed to me very present in certain kinds of art making, where there is such a physical and direct contact with material. And I think that's sort of there in the paper cuts. I mean, this is a huge subject, of course. I mean, books have been written, but I think, you know, in the interests of this context, you know, we've got the paper cut actually displayed next to two Paul Hart black and white prints of aspects of the sort of Fen world, you know, which are sort of hyper still. You know, which is actually rather uncharacteristic of Fen world, but they have that same capacity to absorb you. You know, they're flat images, and they make quite an interesting counterpoint. Anyway, anyone who's listening to this will have to come and see, because it's easy to say and difficult to describe. But this is the other drawing, of course, that we've got in the Waterland exhibition, which is also part of the series of currents. And it's quite interesting to have been sort of looking in detail at the paper cut and then move to the ink drawing, which in one way, this is on the surface of the paper, but because of the different weights of line and so on and the time taken, it has that same sense of dimension. And I found that really fascinating when we were able to choose a couple of works to put in this show, to have sort of, you know, I suppose in some crude way, compare and contrast. And, you know, it's another form of drawing, another kind of absorption in a very physical way with the material, though in this case, ink.
Yeah, I mean, I've just started to use a lot of ink, and this was sort of started this piece when I was doing a residency in Orkney. And one of the things that I'd sort of in my application to the Peer Art Centre had kind of talked about was that the Pentland Firth and why all the renewable energy research, this was 10 years ago, was sort of really proliferating there. It's obviously got much, much bigger now, but at that time there was huge amounts of people just beginning, or they'd well established, but it was at a different stage anyway. So I was able to talk to people in the Heriot Watt University. They've got a campus there, and also very conscious of all the different kind of businesses that were kind of surfacing, which were about making the best possible kind of renewable energy tidal harnessing device, and there was many of them. And what was sort of interesting as well, that in the library in Kirkwall, very accessible and I could handle them, was the Murdo Mackenzie Admiralty Maps, and they apparently were some of the first ones ever made, to my knowledge. And what was really interesting about them was that he had spoken to fishermen and so forth about the water and the tides and so forth. So he was not only gathering information through his own observations, but it was local information about, you know, where not to go and where to go and where there were rocks, because again, that was a long time ago, pre all these kind of acoustic sounding that we have now and stuff like that. There's a place, I think it's near Bercy, there's an area where two tides meet, and you can see there's almost like this kind of they almost kind of meet and come up in the middle, which I think it happens in a lot of places. It certainly seems to happen at the River Ness slightly, but it actually makes a kind of peak.
Yeah, it does. There's the two sort of wind and tide kind of. I mean, for those who don't know the Pentland Firth, it has the biggest tide rips in the British coastal waters, and that is why people have been looking at ways of converting that to energy. And it's good too. I mean, we're sort of traveling widely with water, but it reminds us, of course, your point about the fishermen and so on.
Yes,
you know, that knowledge about, you know, these water worlds, if you like, is held in lots of different ways.
Well, and it's kind of like there's lots of stories about reading water and, you know, all those kind of things, and the idea of undercurrents I like too, like sort of almost like in the body, the sort of under the surface. And, you know, the surface of water, essentially, although this looks kind of more like a map, I suppose, but I wasn't trying to render it to look as if it was water. I just wanted it to look like it was in a constant state of flux, basically.
Yeah.
Like it could equally, if you glanced at it differently, almost look quite like fire, actually, on reflection. But I wanted to use that along the side of the map in Kirkwall Library. There was a beautiful kind of I've forgotten the name of it, when you have an it was called explanation of what the marks were, And they must have been, engraved in copper and so forth before they were printed out. And it has a couple of lines equals something, and a few dots means sandy bay or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just love that notation. It was almost like a kind of musical score.
It is a sort of coding and a scoring of
Yes.
a kind of experience of a place or an element, and in this case, an element. Yeah. So this is the at the Pier Art Centre, that rather wonderful gallery in Stromness in Orkney, which is, as you can see from the image, right on sort of on the waterfront, and has a sort of wonderful connection to sort of 20th century art and sign through various things. And this is currents again, but in a rather different form, isn't it?
Yes. So this is a piece that I made where I modelled water in clay and then plaster molds and then vacuum formed them. So that's actually a skin of which appears to look like water. Well, I suppose it's bringing the outside in so you can look at it, I suppose, which is something that scientists go on field trips and then they bring back data and information and then they kind of look at it in the lab. It wasn't meant to completely emulate that, but I wanted to bring the outside in so that you could look at something and perhaps appreciate it in a different way. In these pictures, you can sort of see on the right-hand one more of an edge. Mm-hmm. So there was an edge to this work. So it feels almost as if I've taken a kind of core sample from the water, brought it in, and you're getting this kind of almost looks like in a tank, but its edges are actually frozen. So that frozen moment.
Well, that frozen moment again that you were talking about earlier. But it is, I mean, maybe it's because, technically aren't we something like 80% water as in our bodily structures. There is this incredibly sort of direct response one has to images of water itself in all its different forms. And there's something kind of very fascinating, though I've only seen images of this piece, about the fact it is, it is water, and yet it's vacuum formed plastic. And there's a sort of interesting element of surprise, almost sort of surreal, really.
Well, I think given the, I mean, this was made quite a long time ago, but given the highlighting in COP26 as we're talking right now, that's on, and I'm very I don't think I would make this piece in that way again, put it like that, but it was interesting and it allowed me to kind of make the skin. And I haven't thrown it away into an ocean or anything. I've kept it and it's still.
But I think also, things, as with any work of art, I mean, one could cite numerous examples, keeps finding its context in a way.
Yes.
And I felt that actually rather clearly with this. So that actually, the fact that it makes you halt and think and look in a slightly different way is not in any way, I think, a bad thing.
It kind of has a very strong sense of skin or sort of meniscus when you're with it. And because it's got all the undulations, which I kind of modeled through my imagination, actually, being in Scotland, I've lived with, summer holidays on the west coast of Scotland, kind of. So this feels like it's that sort of water. It's not Mediterranean water, for
example. Has a touch of the grey.
When the curator Andrew Parkinson suggested that there's some very beautiful kind of chambers within the downstairs of the Pier Art Centre, and this one, as you can see, looks straight out onto the water in the harbour. And I was slightly reluctant to put it there, thinking, how could it possibly not compare, but live alongside it? But actually, it was quite interesting. And I had never anticipated that. This had been made before I was offered a show.
You modelled it, you made molds, you vacuum formed it. There is sort of sitting in the background, rather a laboratory of making. We're now moving into the realm of meteorology more directly, I guess. But this is a shot, I think, of you installing a piece called Conditions at the V&A, is that right?
Yes, I think
in 2012, but this is the actual piece. The vivid sense that one has of the time you take to research in different ways, that's conversations with other people, forms of knowledge, places, looking at places, drawing, photography, and so on. There's a technical precision and yet something poetic really strongly coming through, something very different. And I think this is in my view, a very clear example of that.
There's 12 blocks of optical glass, and they are 40 centimeters high by 15 by 15, and they're very dense optical glass, so very, very clear. You can't see like you can with some glass. You can kind of see how there's kind of movement in it, but it's actually looks
it's very pure.
It's like a microscope
crown glass.
Yeah. And each one weighs 25 kilos, so they're very heavy things. And I worked very closely with a fantastic meteorologist called Stan Cornford, who used to predict the weather in the 1960s. I met him when I was doing a residency in the Royal Institution in 2000. And he was such a fantastically enthusiastic person. Of the V&A were curating this exhibition called Out of the Ordinary. And I sort of was also very interested in the Constable Cloud paintings that they own. And just thinking about that idea of cloud formations basically being very ordinary, actually, especially in and around the UK and London. It's what, it's often cloudy, and us British people talk about the weather a lot, and because it affects us so much. So it's kind of lots of different kind of strands went into the thinking behind this, and then thinking about 40 centimeters high being almost, but not quite, accurately, but similar to the 35,000 feet above in our atmosphere where clouds live. And then beyond that, as I understand it, it sort of becomes impossible for them to live in. They just don't exist beyond about 35 to 40,000 feet. So there was a nice kind of 40 centimeters. So I was trying to use that idea of, again, kind of taking a core sample of the sky, if you could, and looked at it, and then thinking about those different levels of where at the very top, that one, this kind of more icy looking, snowy kind of cloud formation, where the higher you go, the colder it gets, apparently. And then, the one which is second on the right, which is a kind of autocumulus, I think it is. Second from the left. And that's sort of quite low level, and something that happens. And each one of these corresponded to the average cloud formation on a given month. So that one second from the left is May, I know for a fact. Mm-hmm. And then the other ones go right on to December. And I wanted them to be not really pictorial, but almost as if somebody had taken a core sample of the sky, and these clouds, which are constantly moving, would almost be drifting out of the sort of frame of the space of the core sample, and they'd almost be drifting off. And I suppose just that idea again of things being in flux and in suspension, and can very easily change, almost like the mind. That there have been artists in the past who've made work about the idea of equivalence of cloud formations being like moods and things. And I suppose I was aware of that, but I was thinking more in terms of actually their physicality, and just the fact that there's these millions of droplets of water suspended through air movement and hot air, and all sorts of different reasons why they're suspended, and how magnificent they are actually, these clouds above us. In the way that the ocean completely meets, every ocean is connected in our world, in our planet, and the clouds they're affected by what goes on underneath them, i.e. if there's a big sort of huge big kind of coal firing, something rather going on underneath it. But given that, they also just float over. So we could have a cloud floating over London, which could equally just be floating over Paris, and of several hours or so forth, at least a mutation of it or transformation of it. And I quite like the freedom that clouds have, actually.
Yeah, wonderful sense of sort of movement and kind of something passing by rather quickly. Yet within this very solid object. So again, there's a sort of tension in a way between the laser engraving, I think.
That's what they are. There's this just in a nutshell is that they, as I understand it, and they were actually done in Paris. Luckily for me, as somebody who speaks English, because I don't speak French. Yes, it's like the kind of laser that has a focal range, and the data that I made clouds in the studio and then scanned them. And so we're working 3D modeling, and then they're made they're subsurface etched, and it has a kind of focal length which just fractures the glass inside. So it's almost as if you were getting your eyes done and the
Yeah.
laser going in to do something to your eye to alter it and make it better. If it didn't have a focal length, and it would just carry on into the rest of your body, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think it's again, that's a sort of wonderful description of both the collaborative process, which is very much a dimension of your working life, a very different kind of working, which is there are a whole series of these snow drawings. Which,
yes, I've made a lot. This January, I'd had COVID, and I was keen to kind of make something of the snow because it felt very rejuvenating and fresh. And we went up to the Horniman Museum, and they had icicles falling off, and I was bringing them back and putting them in my small freezer and making work with that, and then, to make it visible, I was adding ink. And so what this was actually a combination of melting, using snow and adding ink, and then dropping it from quite high up. Actually, the mess it made on the floor was quite, you can see the splatters, but the ink is acrylic ink, so it's water-based. So it's quite nice because it's difficult to describe it, but the ones which are white, which just edges, with a kind of black mark in them, yes, that was me throwing it with a small amount of ink in. And I was just interested really in that edge, actually, to be honest, to begin with. And then I would ignore the fact, if you can imagine these without any grid around them to begin with. And so they were just splattered all over the paper. And then I started to add degrees of more ink to make it more visible, and then kind of leave them so that they were there was a layering going on. You can see, if you look closely, that the ones which are with less ink are basically on the back, and then they layer up. So I was just trying to capture that sense of coldness and ice and layering and using the snow from outside, and a mixture, so to speak, and then the gravitational thing, which feels very important. So I was standing above it and dropping them, sometimes getting even higher up onto a chair and letting them splatter. What I was really interested in was the idea that, in a way, a bit like the water, trying to draw water or trying to make something frozen, just the idea of holding it in space with this grid. So I got a rotring set, which I've always wanted to own one, and I did in lockdown. And then I started to I gave myself some rules, and I don't know if you can kind of make it out, but I was only allowed to put the grid sort of to connect everything, and the grid was had to sort of almost go through the center of the blob, or at least hold it in place. So it was like a coordinate, like a map coordinate. But
I'm completely fascinated that it was that way around. But the sort of setting yourself those parameters, within which something happens.
Especially one on the left really shows that. So it was almost like the chance thing, the chance element, the natural thing creates the structure around it, in which, rather than it being the other way around. I've shown these to architects I'm working with, and they certainly didn't get it, and they're very kind of orientated towards grids and so forth, until they got it. And then when they began to think of it as a structure, or like an armature, we had lots of conversations about that. So it's kind of interesting, just a certain twist of the other way around, rather than adding something to a grid, building a grid around something which is chance.
So we're now sort of leaping a sort of scale, but I wanted, because, public commissions have been an important part of your practice, and we're lucky enough to have one in Cambridge at Anglia Ruskin. So this is a site-specific commission you did for their new science centre, completed in 2018, called Transformations. It's a kinetic work positioned across 2 sides and 5 stories of a building designed by the Edinburgh architect Richard Murphy. I think we now have moved, in a way, we've moved elements from water to air. And perhaps you could just talk a little bit about how this came about.
I've started to make large-scale public artworks since about 2007. It was slightly unintentional. Somebody asked me to pitch for something, and then I ended up getting it in Oxford Biochemistry department, and I really enjoyed it because I loved the scale. So when this opportunity arose for Anglia Ruskin in the new Science Centre, I again was very pleased to be successful in the application. I was aware of Richard Murphy's work, and being an Edinburgh person myself, I'd sort of seen lots of examples of his work. But having said that, I was actually just thinking of really sort of what might work in that area. And as Waterland so clearly demonstrates the sort of flatness of the area. I know it's not immediate, it's close by Cambridge, but there are elements that, as it were, that are kind of accentuated, like the wind, for example, and the air, and just the sense of space and the flatness. And there's a flatness and similarity of that sense of space just outside of Edinburgh as you go south. So it felt sort of almost slightly familiar, although we don't have fenland there, but it's very windy and so forth, and the light. One of the things they asked me to do was to see science in action was one of the things they talked about. They really wanted that. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. My first reaction was, how will I do that? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And how will I make it relevant to the rest of my practice? Because I don't like to see it separate from, say, the drawings or the other work, which isn't shown here, but, the currents, which was at the Pure Arts Centre and so forth. And I see this as all part of the same body of work. It's just done in a slightly different way with a bigger budget.
And also with different kind of interface, between the work and people.
Exactly. And this has to live in the public realm, and it has to go through planning, and it has to be something that you leave and people will enjoy. One of the things that I don't like about certain public art is that it's put there and then suddenly you don't really notice it after a while because it somehow looks dusty and old, doesn't really live through time. So this piece was very important for me to think that it would be stimulating to look at. The top left drawing looks like there's a lot of space around to see it, but actually that's one of the architect drawings, just about the building. You never really get that clear distance from the piece, actually. Where we're looking from, that vantage point of the corner, is another building. I had a choice of different places I could put the work, and I decided that these kind of faces were the most interesting for me. So this is facing west. So the edge of that left-hand side, which is kind of silver anodized aluminium, when the sun sets, hits that corner, and it almost makes it go gold, which is quite nice if the sun's out and it's a sunny evening. But it does go, as you can see there, from blue right through to the other side. It goes into kind of gold. And I was thinking about the idea of transformation from the point of view of the way scientists use heat and cold in their work to kind of bring things to life and then to cool them and to freeze them. And just the way that, we're in a constant state of kind of homeostasis, of everything kind of adjusting and changing, whether we're inside or outside and our bodies shivering or becoming too hot and we sweat or something like that. And just thinking about the world is not static and it's ever changing. So that was the kind of thinking behind going from gold right through to blue. But you can see the squares, which are, I think they're about 5 centimeters square or something like that, if I recall. And they're on little pivots, and they're moving in response to the wind. They're in brackets. And they just respond. There's no electricity involved or anything like that.
So you can sort of see, I think, from those two images, that sort of changing pattern, which is just the movement of the tessera or the little tile.
Exactly. Yeah. This is it. Yeah, there's a sound. Yes. Anyway, there was a soundtrack that went with this, but so you can see a close up there that it's moving. And that was actually not a particularly windy day when we were filming. Inevitably, every time we went up to film it, it was actually quite a nice day without much wind. But on a kind of stormy day, it moves a lot. It's very dynamic when you start to watch it. But they come out of some people were saying that they actually come out to see what's going on if they know it's windy.
It's the flow and the current, and you're right. Yes. It's also just to sort of root us again in this fen landscape. The wind does come straight at you because there aren't any hills between you and North Russia. So we're going to finish with a soon-to-be held, slightly delayed, collaborative exhibition.
Yes.
And so really, I was wanting just to call attention to the fact that your collaboration works in all directions. Of course, you also teach, but we haven't really touched on that. But obviously working with all these different scientists and so on, but you're also, you know, this deep, long practice, you've obviously been looking also at the work of other artists, one of whom is the late Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, St Andrews, St Ives and so on. And you've been doing some work with two other artists in the archive to create this exhibition, which will happen at some point, possibly later this year. For those watching, if you follow that link to the Barnes-Graham Trust, you can find out more about them. And the exhibition is mentioned in their most recent newsletter, which is up on their website. So this is a work with your hand giving, I think it's your hand giving a sense of scale.
Yeah. Sometimes it's very difficult, isn't it, to get any sense of judgment of scale, but the hand, you get it immediately.
Yeah.
But also, you know, I mean, this, yes, it started just briefly, yeah, the kind of idea of harbour, which was this research group, which I was kind of invited to be part of by Gillian McFarland, and she's based in Scotland and near to where Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham had one of her houses in, I think it's Balmerino. Lockdown came and we were just discussing her work in relationship to the way that she used drawing. And we'd talked about our research project being called Harbour, thinking of it in relationship to when you come, you know, that kind of liminal space where you arrive in on a coastline and where a harbour is and where it's not, so to speak. What happens in a harbour and the stillness and being able to kind of anchor for a while and probably being on a journey. And we've also have Rahima White, who's from St Andrews University, who's part of it, and she's very engaged in teaching with her students about the effect of climate change and so forth. So with COP26 coming on, we thought it would be nice, and in discussion with Rob Airy, who's the director at the Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham Trust, we thought it'd be nice to perhaps highlight some of the work that Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham did about looking at the glaciers and also the coastline, which now is being affected with water rising and so forth because of climate change. And just the nuances of the way that she works, and her as an artist who devoted her whole life to making work. And that was her choice. And luckily she was able to fulfill that. And there's a really rich archive about her work and her thinking. And so she seemed a really good example of somebody who was very connected to the landscape. This work's called Everything is Connected, thinking of that idea of the juxtaposition of, say, the graph and the splatters, gestural line which continues and continues and continues and overlaps in pencil. And then at the intersections of where they meet, I make a dot to connect them, to root them, to make them more plotted, I suppose, so to speak. And it's quite interesting because my very speedy line in the pencil is then kind of, I'm sort of thinking about that idea of different senses of time of plotting afterwards and making something visible. So the lines and the shapes that I've made and the have a kind of almost like a three-dimensionality about them.
Feels like a sort of notation in a way, almost of thought. And of course the title, Everything's Connected, feels very, very of the moment.
Well, that's it, the cause and effect, and the idea of, you know, sort of one thing does have an effect on everything else, and we are all living in the same, I mean, it's loose, it's not meant to, it speaks of that, as they say, but it's not necessarily.
It's evocative or resonant. I mean, the works to be looking at are never sort of directly illustrative, but I think my experience of them, both physically and actually in image form that we've been looking at, is that they do stimulate thought. I mean, so we started with this idea of the linking between sort of visual thinking, which again, obviously is a phrase you could unpack quite a lot, but for the purposes of this short talk, it's a particular kind of thinking in relation to the experience of environment and data of different sorts. I'm going back now just to the two drawings that are on show at Fen Ditton Gallery. And it's really fantastic that we've been able to include them. And actually, for me, really fascinating to be able to reflect a little bit further and deeper on your work. And thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be in the exhibition, and I hope everybody can visit if they're able to and see it. Can we stop?